In AD 66, the Jews rebelled against the Romans. The First Jewish War began. In 70 AD, the Romans captured Jerusalem and destroyed it. A wave of repression swept through Judea. In general, about 600,000 Jews died. The last stronghold of the rebels was the Masada fortress, translated from Hebrew. This is the fortress, off the southwestern coast of the Dead Sea. For 3 years the fortress was under siege. When all the forces ran out, the defenders, and this is about 1,000 people with their families, committed suicide. All the defenders of the fortress were zealots, that is, conscious fighters not even against Rome, but against the Hellenic culture in general, including the ancient Roman one. The battle group of the defenders was made up of sicarii, professional assassins who wore a sword in their clothes. They committed terrorist acts not always of a political nature. There were also simple contract killings. The fortress of Masada was difficult to access. A narrow path led inside. Even lightly armed warriors like the sicarii could easily defend it. The very fortress of Masada in 25 BC was built by the king of Judea, Herod the Great, as a refuge. The fortress was completed on the basis of an older fortress. Sheer cliffs surround Masada from all sides. From the side of the sea, a narrow, so-called snake path leads up. From the west, you can climb to the fortress along a path laid along an artificial embankment built by the Romans. In about 30 minutes, the top of the rock is crowned by an almost flat trapezoidal plateau, the dimensions of which are approximately 600 by 300 meters. The plateau is surrounded by powerful fortress walls with a total length of 1,400 meters and a thickness of about 4 meters, in which 37 towers are arranged. Palaces, a synagogue, armories, pits for collecting and storing rainwater, and other auxiliary buildings were built on the plateau. The fortress had large warehouses. In them, food could be stored for many years. Water was stored in 12 tanks. She went there with the rain. Cutters allowed each drop to be used for its intended purpose. Despite this, the stored water in the fortress was only enough for 500 people annually. All the same, Israel is not the Mekong Valley. The Romans were systematically besieging Masada. They erected a shaft from which they threw shells. Then they built a ram. He was led along the shaft to the wall and punched through it. But after the outer wall, the Romans met with a wooden wall. She had to be set on fire. After that, the fate of the sicarii was sealed. When it became clear that the capture of the fortress was inevitable, all the defenders of Masada decided not to surrender to the mercy of the victors, but to die as free people, laying their hands on themselves. 2 women and 5 children who hid in the reservoir witnessed a terrible tragedy. The men killed their wives and children. Then 10 people were chosen by lot, who were to kill the rest. They cut the throats of all the male defenders of the fortress. Then they burned all the jewels, except for food, because the Romans should not have thought that they were driven to suicide by hunger. One of the 10 killed the rest, set fire to the fortress and fell on his sword. It happened on April 15, 72. So the last defenders of Masada perished with the certainty that they did not leave behind a single soul that the Romans could abuse. The Roman soldiers who entered the territory of the fortress prepared for a fierce battle. They were surprised to find that there was no one to fight with. They were met with silence. They were amazed by the spectacle they saw, the fortitude, stamina, devotion to their ideals of the defenders of the fortress. Thus ended the 7-year struggle of the Jews against Roman tyranny. The history of the citadel also ended. Following this, the Roman garrison again settled in Masada. After a while, Byzantine monks settled here. After their departure, Masada became uninhabited and abandoned until the present day. Interest in its history was renewed by American researchers A. Robinson and A. Simt in 1839. The ruins of the citadel were discovered in 1862. Full-fledged excavations began 100 years later. The Masada fortress is included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Modern researchers found only about 30 remains in the fortress. Although, according to Joseph Flavius, a participant in the Jewish uprising, the Romans left everything in the fortress as it is. All this most likely indicates that there was no mass suicide. As Flavius assured, there was an assault in battle inside the fortress, and the survivors were taken prisoner. Otherwise, there were much more human remains in the fortress. But this is just the version of scientists, and we will probably never know how it actually happened.